Hi, I'm Evan from Small Axe Farm. My wife Heidi and I run a certified organic 1 acre off-grid market farm in Barnet, Vermont, which is up in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, about 55 miles from the Canadian border. We have used the Paperpot Transplanter for about 5 years now, and really 3 of those years have been more intensive. We first borrowed the Paperpot Transplanter from a local farm to try it out in the fall of 2016. And then we purchased it in 2017. And actually, the first loan we ever took on our farm was to buy the Paperpot Transplanter and a few other pieces of equipment. Before that, we had always paid as we went. But this was the first time that we were like, well, we should really, we can't afford this now, but this is gonna make us money quickly, and it did. We use about, just to give a sense of scale and how we use the Paperpot Transplanter, we use about 800 Paperpot trays a year. And some beds may only get 1 tray per bed if we're using 3 rows with a 6-inch cell, and just by happenstance, our beds are 45 feet long. When we first started gardening, we made our little garden beds 15 feet long, and then as we got a little bigger, they were 30 feet long. And since we'd always used that 15-foot increment, 45 foot is our standard garden bed, which typically for a market farmer, it's either 50 feet or 100 feet. That happens to work really well for a Paperpot Transplanter because they average out around 45 feet in length for a single row, or 3 45-foot rows for a 6-inch Paperpot tray. So that kind of gives a sense of how many trays, how we're using those trays. Sometimes we'll do up to 6 rows in a bed. And then sometimes 6 trays in a bed if we're doing single rows of tightly spaced greens and 2-inch cells. And then sometimes we'll use just 1 tray per bed if we're doing 3 rows at 6-inch spacing. I think something that is really important for us is we grow in a short climate. We're in zone 4 up here, and we really just we are a year-round farm, and we do grow greens over the winter, and we grow microgreens over the winter, but really to make our income, we have about 6 months, and it's all got to happen then. And what the Paperpot Transplanter has allowed us is just to get an extra crop in per bed, probably on average every year. And that's a big deal because, it tends to be a valuable crop. So we can get our crops in the ground sooner. It may not warm up enough to transplant into our hoop houses with a seedling until mid-March, maybe later March some years, just depending on the weather forecast. But we have the Paperpot trays ready to go right away. And then we can plant out all the greenhouses in a day if we need to with the stuff that we're planting in seedlings. Direct seeding, we can usually do a little earlier than that. So, and then likewise, at the end of the year, we can squeeze an extra crop out of our hoop houses, sometimes 2 extra crops after the summer crops, say the cucumbers or the tomatoes, are ready to pull at the end of the season. So on both ends of the year, those are big advantages for us. And never mind the advantage of, skipping 10 days of growth time for transplanting seedlings of crops that would only be worth direct seeding otherwise. So these are ways that the Paperpot has really helped us out. This is a picture of our farm. We farm on a steep hillside in Barnet, and it was all overgrown pasture land when we bought the land, and with some fairly large trees, but it was flat with really great soil, smooth, not flat, with really great soil. So you can see we're just perched right up on a hillside here. And this is our cabin. That cabin that you see in the background there was, we live off grid, and we built that by hand with hand tools and lived in there for 4 years. Just a little 12 by 16 cabin. Our summer kitchen is in front of it, and these beds, which are part of our farm now, were our initial homestead gardens. So I hope that gives folks a picture of our farm. One thing I do want to just talk about right away is just some income changes on our farm since having the Paperpot Transplanter. In the first year we used it was 2016, and wasn't really part of our production. But our income was $36,000 that year for our farm. We were still working off farm part-time. The next year we employed it a bit more, but we hadn't fully committed to it yet because of issues with organic certification. And our income jumped to $49,000. The next year, $68,000 in 2018. 2019, we really implemented it. We had learned the system and really learned how to use it. Our income jumped from $68,000 to $112,000. 2020, $150,000. This year, we're projected to be at 2021 at probably $177,000 in income from our acre. We have added a little bit of land on. Those first years we were only 3/4 of an acre, and made other infrastructure improvements. So the Paperpot Transplanter is not responsible for all of that income growth, but it has certainly played a big part. And for us, that matters. This is our living. We have no backup besides the income we make from our farm. And we're at the time in our lives when saving for our retirement and all that is important to us. I'm gonna just cover now some of the ways that the Paperpot Transplanter, some of the advantages for us. And one of them is spring, is just getting a jump every spring on transplanting seedlings into our greenhouses with crops that might not be worth it otherwise, or that we might not have space to grow enough seedlings for. The compact Paperpot trays are great. Oftentimes we're carrying these out or sledding these out up the hill through the snow for our first planting dates. And the one thing about March, particularly when we're planting, is we can still have nights as low as -20 in March. So we really have to watch the weather. And so just having these seedlings ready when that weather window hits is really important for us in our climate. And it allows us to get that jump on the market, to get a couple more weeks of really big sales in the springtime once everything's up and running. And those income from those a couple additional weeks really helps out. And as I mentioned before, it really allows us to maximize our rotations and our high tunnels and not miss any chance of using that valuable tunnel space. Here's a picture of me transplanting in very early spring in a cat tunnel, and you can see that whole wall is being bowed in by snowbanks, and having to plant right up against the wall there, which isn't super fun, but it works. Right. So I think fall is similar to spring. It just allows us to get those seedlings in there very early on, which is really great for us. And then we head into, I'm just going to take a little break here, Diego.
You're all good.
Yeah. This picture we're showing right here are our spring, our only heated house in the spring, which we very minimally heat early on to keep our cold hardy seedlings alive. We keep our warm seedlings inside of a heated building in the early spring. But as you can see, there's a lot of paper potted crops in here. All of these crops are paper potted. We have these wide rows, which are transplanted with radishes, Salanova lettuce on the outside of the rows, and then radishes and fast-growing Asian greens in the center of the rows. And then as we transition later in spring and it comes time to plant our tomatoes, about mid-April is when we can feel like we can reliably heat the house. we'll have already harvested that first round of radishes and Asian greens from the center of the beds. And then we will paper pot maybe a new round of radishes or something quick growing in the very center of the bed, and plant tomatoes on either side, as you can see in this picture. So that allows us to get multiple crops in the springtime out of these beds. And in the meantime, the Salanova is cranking right along, and we'll be harvesting that for several cuttings as the tomatoes are growing. So we pay for our heat and our effort long before the first tomato is ever picked in this house with these early crops. And the Paperpot Transplanter allows us to do it. The middles of these beds are growing 2 crops even before the tomatoes are producing. So that's a really great thing for us. And then just like in spring and fall, we're rushing in transplanted crops right after our summer crops are done. You can see this big stack of trays here from this whole greenhouse, just having tomatoes removed, or I think in this house it was cucumbers, and then right into greens that are other seedlings or greens that are ready to jump and be ready before it freezes up, which our production in really cold years can stop in mid-November or be very slowed down by then. So the sooner we get crops in, the better, because there's no guarantee. So the other real important thing for us about the Paperpot Transplanter is opportunity costs. The concept of, like, if you have the opportunity to do something because you're not doing something else, you can really gain. And so having the drop seeder combined with the Paperpot Transplanter system and the Paperpot trays allows us to be able to do these things in a very short period of time. If we need to seed a ton of seedlings to get ready for the next transition, it happens fast. And if we need to transplant it, it happens fast. And so that way, if something else really critical needs to be done on the farm, or really critical in terms of self-care for us and our family, we have the time to do that, because these big jobs can happen very quickly. So that opens up this opportunity to do other things. And that's been responsible for a lot of income growth, and then also for critical time for taking care of ourselves and our family. So there are some unique advantages to the Paperpot Transplanter system, and I'm going to use this crop, Claytonia, as an example. Claytonia in our region is really only performs at its peak if it's planted in the fall and it's overwintered, and which is great. And it's a really valuable crop that could be cut many times well into the spring. It really adds to our greens mixes, and is just a unique and wonderful crop, and very high yielding per bed, probably the most high yielding per bed in its good years of any crop on the farm in terms of the amount of income you could generate per bed. I think that one challenge for us, though, was taking up valuable fall green space in our greenhouses to get the Claytonia started, and then have it protecting it all winter, and then we got these great harvests in the springtime. Sometimes we'd get a little harvest in the fall, but with the Paperpot Transplanter system, we still do overwinter some Claytonia. We do plant direct seed or Paperpot transplant it in the fall, but we also then can get seedlings going in January and then plant them out in February if we harden them off well, because it's a very cold hardy crop as long as it's hardened off, and skip that fall planting, and we're able to have some other money-making crop in there in the fall. So this is a really good example of, it would never be worth it for us to hand transplant the amount of Claytonia we have. It would just take days. But in the Paperpot Transplanter, it takes minutes, really, in comparison. And then I think something for us that was a surprise, or maybe not something we were expecting, is it has allowed us consistent production, particularly for crops like radishes and salad turnips, which they direct seeded, they do very well, but you can very easily lose plantings of them. Not only in germination, but after germination, they're very tender crops, which insects or various other critters can just come through and wipe out a bed really quickly when they're small. With the Paperpot transplanter, we just consistently can depend on this crop every time we need it. We rarely lose the crop. And so it's really made these crops, which are great money makers and crops we love to have for our customers, just be more consistent. So that's a real advantage. Oops, I'm gonna go back here. The other advantage is just reduced cultivation with these crops. Typically radishes and especially salad turnips, we would have to cultivate once at least during their growth cycle. But with the Paperpot system, we rarely if ever have to cultivate them because they get that 10-day head start. And they've just outgrown the weeds before they're a problem. And so these are crops we never have to touch generally for cultivation. And that's a big savings. Another great advantage, which we have done a lot, is interplanting with Paperpot trays. So for instance, sometimes we'll plant early broccoli in a Paperpot tray, and then we might interplant that, and we want that, say, 12 inches apart. This is fast growing, small, early broccoli. And so we use a 6-inch tray. And then with this tape pattern here, we might do every other hole with bok choy or maybe radishes, multi-pack radishes, something pretty fast growing like that. And this allows us to kind of just to drop seed those right in if we want to. Or if with small brassica seeds, we will tend to have to hand transplant them. And so then we'll just, because the drop seeder doesn't work for really tiny seeds, then we just use pieces of cardboard to block off every other hole so we don't forget. And then we just plant this allows us to plant every other cell, hand transplanted. If particularly with broccoli and say bok choy, we would be hand transplanting those. And so kind of same concept here, but it's great to be able to interplant easily within the same tray. So I just want to go through some crops that are real winners for us with the Paperpot system. This is big bok choy. We plant this 3 rows, 6 inches apart. And this is a mainstay all season long. And the Paperpot just allows us to always have it. And we, if we were too busy to get a bed prepped and direct seed it in the field in the past, we would just miss it. But now if we're too busy, it takes 5 minutes to seed a couple trays, and then we have time to get those bed preps and transplant it. Likewise, these are crops that rarely ever need to be weeded because of the jump they get in their growth. Baby alliums of all kinds, so scallions, baby leeks, shallots, all of these crops are crops that we can just have readily on hand all season long, and they really do best densely planted, and the Paperpot system works great for that. So these are generally at 4-inch spacings with the baby alliums and with multi-pack cells. Spinach. We try to have spinach all season long. Even though we are in the north, we do have very hot summers. So, and it wouldn't be worth it when we were so busy in the summer to hand transplant spinach, although in times in the fall or the spring, it might be worth it. Because it's much lower yielding in the summer, it just wouldn't be worth it. We can then start spinach seeds in the middle of August or July. We germinate them in our root cellar, which is a nice, usually 50 degrees around then. And then we can have spinach all season long in general because of Paperpot trays, where we wouldn't really bother if we were direct seeding all season long in our environment, just because although we could get it all season long on some years, we would have enough crop failure that it would not make the grade for us. Beets is another crop that we do, and then this is a good interplanting of cilantro and scallions, and then We might do the same thing with cutting dill and scallions. Green beans, filet beans, that's a crop that's pretty marginal as a profitable crop for a market farm just because of the high labor cost to pick. And then if you combine that with the occasional poor germination, which is pretty, I would say 1 out of every 3 bean crops, depending on what time of year we plant it, had in the past would have, marginal germination. And so we would have all this bed space taken aside for a crop that wasn't very profitable, that then was going to cost us a lot of money to pick or a lot of time. And with the Paperpot tray, we can eliminate some of that bed space, and then we get consistent germination every time, a bean seed every 4 inches, and we have great yields with this system, 3 rows per 30-inch bed. So this is a crop we probably would not be growing if we weren't using the Paperpot transplanter, because it cuts off some of the potential losses that made this crop even less profitable. Salanova type lettuce. That's another example of a crop where we grow a lot of that, not just Salanova, but other cutting lettuces. And in big sections, we'll tend to plant 360 row feet at a time. At least probably averaging around every week, we'll plant 360 row feet. That's thousands and thousands of seedlings to plant by hand. So we just wouldn't have the time in the busy season when most of our time is taken up with harvest and washing. So the Paperpot transplanter has allowed us to increase lettuce production there. Also, one of our favorite, a really good crop for us is just regular cutting leaf lettuce. It tends to do much better Paperpot transplanted in 2-inch cells, 5 or 6 rows per bed. It's just reliable. It takes up less bed space. And then weeds are a big issue with direct seeded baby lettuce because it takes longer to grow than, say, fast going brassica greens. And so it's the Paperpot system works really well for, we typically use Johnny's 5-star mix or other lettuce mixes like that. So that's also a great crop. I want to talk a little bit about just a picture of doing some cultivation here, I think I'm zippering in some Salanova here. I want to talk a little bit about some of the cons of the Paperpot transplanting system, because I think it's important to talk about that. Actually, Dave, I'm going to back up and I'll get back to that. I skipped one section.
Okay. Did the internet kind of cut out because your video went out?
Oh, probably.
No, it's not. That's okay. I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, internet's kind of marginal here. Do you think this will still be effective without that video?
Yeah. No, that's fine. You're okay.
Yeah, that's probably, I don't think I did anything, but that's probably what happened. You're still able to see pictures though?
Yep. Yeah. The audio's smooth. The pictures are flowing good, but I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah,
okay.
let's go with it. It's probably as good as we're going to get.
Okay.
I want to talk a little bit about our farm, in that as I mentioned earlier, we farm on a steep hillside. And so our fields average close to a 15% grade. So that's over every 10 feet, we're dropping about 1.5 feet, which is actually quite steep. If a rock starts rolling, it's going to keep rolling on that grade. And the transplanter has some pros and cons in this setting. And a lot of them are pros, but the great thing about it is it's a lightweight tool. It's easy to carry around. And that's really helpful for us because a good chunk of our season, there's either mud or ice and snow, which allows us not to drive vehicles up to our fields, which are not easily accessed unless the ground is in pretty good condition. And so we can easily, as soon as these beds thaw, the field beds thaw, we can carry the Paperpot transplanter up. Maybe we'll have to pull those trays up in the sled over the snow or whatever, and we can get going right away. On our hillside, even if we wanted to farm with a tractor, it wouldn't really be practical and it wouldn't work well. And so other transplanting systems like a water wheel transplanter or something like that would be impractical given our steep slope. And we love farming on a slope. It has its challenges, but I think it's important to know that for people in all cultures who don't have access to to resources, and typically lower income people and poor people all over the world, hillsides are where they have to farm, and it's where their chance is to own land. And that was the same for us. We come from low income backgrounds, and buying steep land was one way to allow us to purchase land. And although we come from a wealthy society and consider ourselves wealthy and have the great advantage of being white in America, we still would have had trouble buying land and getting started in this process. And buying steep land was a way that we could. And then we've learned how to farm on it, and it has a lot of benefits. Some of the cons is it is challenging to get the Paperpot transplanter to plant properly in our beds. Because some of the tops of the beds are slopes, it can slip downhill. And so it is challenging to train employees to use the tool here. And some years we'll have employees who can get it, and some years we don't. And we just have to accept that. And then also because of that, we'll tend to have to spend more time filling in cells, which you can see in this picture here I'm doing with this tool here, just filling in dirt around the soil around the cells. Great. I'm going to cover just a few other cons of the transplanting system. That one thing that we were initially hesitant about, we found out about the Paperpot probably around 2012. There were some farms in our area starting to use it when it was first brought over here from Japan. And it was kind of out of our price range then, just to even buy the transplanter or buy trays, just given where our homestead and farm was at. So we knew about it then. And one of the things that we were hesitant about is that the cell trays come at a cost. And so as long as your crops are successful, that cost is really negligible and totally worth it. But when your crops fail or other things happen, then those costs start to add up. But it's a con, and it's a con that we're happy to accept. Paperpot seedlings require a longer period of care before they establish themselves. So these tender little seedlings here need to be watered, need to be protected from cold, more than kind of bigger, hardier transplants. And so sometimes if we're not paying attention or we just get the wrong set of circumstances, we might lose crops due to that. And typically I'd say for normal seedlings around here in average conditions, probably about 4 days, and their roots start to get out of we use soil blocks for our other seedlings, and the roots come out of the soil blocks and start to be able to absorb water well. With the Paperpot cells, because of the paper on the sides of the walls, the roots have to really work their way out of the bottom. And so it's probably more like 6 or 7 days before we can kind of relax and not be watering them whenever they get dry. Another part of this is just paper buildup on the farm. That's another con, is we sometimes have to go through and kind of rake out the paper. We've been trialing hemp paper pots, and there's some hope that they're going to degrade better. So we're going to be kind of learning more about that. And so we consider that a con. It's just another task we have to do, but compared to the labor savings, of the transplanter system, it's one we happily do. One thing that we do to protect our seedlings, and we've been doing this, for a long time, probably for close to 15 years from when we started, is we've always had some shade cloth around. And when we transplant Paperpot cells out into the field, we generally always put shade cloth over them if we're in the hot season, or if the weather forecast is calling for sun. This allows us to have to water them a lot less, which is great. So I wanted to include just a few little tips and tricks. Some of these we made up ourselves, some of these we learned, but occasionally on our farm, we have to carry a big stack of trays somewhere. And so because we can't drive everywhere on our farm at certain times of year. So this is an example of, I use the same racks that you use for spreading the cells on, spreading the accordion trays on. We can put them on top of a tray, and then I can carry 5 trays because we have 5 of those, just stacked right on top of each other, as long as the seedlings aren't too big. These are some baby greens, which we tend to transplant when they're on the smaller side. So that's just a nice little trick. Another thing that we did pretty early on, even when, is just drill an extra hole so that when we're planting on the tight edge of a tunnel, we can turn the handle sideways. And that allows us to not have that handle be hitting the plastic on this cat tunnel, which the upper edge, because our hillside is sloped, is always really tight. And in this picture, because of the snow, is especially tight. Sometimes if we're doing a bunch of trays, I'll just put little blocks in the corners. That does the same thing as the metal racks. And we also use our Paperpot Transplanter for planting microgreens. We use the trays, not the transplanter, but we use the trays, and then we use the drop seeder, particularly for the smaller brassica microgreens. And so that makes that job really fast. The trays are super durable. And so we use the trays for a few different purposes, which is really great. One last thing I wanted to mention was that the reason I'm doing this presentation and not Heidi, we farm together, we share the work, we've had different roles over the years, but I have a chronic back injury and a degenerative condition in my spine. And so transplanting was just not something that I could do very often, because having two hands out without my back supported just didn't work. But as our business grew, I couldn't do that job, which was a big part of the job on our farm. But as the business grew, Heidi, who was more in charge of managing harvest and marketing and doing that end of the business, was having less and less time to be in the field. So the Paperpot Transplanter, and she's just much better at that than I am. And the Paperpot Transplanter allowed me to take over the job of doing a lot of the transplanting and working with employees to do it, because it was very hard for me to work with employees to have them do something that I couldn't do myself very well. And so this allows me to do a lot of the transplanting and take that load off of her. So it's allowed a little shift on our farm, which has been good for both of us, giving us both more breathing room to do what we need to do. I would like to close by saying that we have a short, wild season up here in the north with big swings of temperature and precipitation. And the Paperpot system allows us to be light on our feet and to adjust quickly to changing conditions. And I think one big thing is it really allows us to recover from crop failures quickly. We had really hot 90-degree weather in May that we weren't expecting, that burnt a bunch of crops out. We just couldn't keep up with the watering. Or if we have a late cold snap where it gets to 12 degrees in May and we lose crops in the field, we can turn around really quickly because we always have extra trays and just and fill in those beds with the Paperpot Transplanter system. So I think those are the main ways that we use this system, and I hope folks find this helpful. Every farm is different, and everybody's kind of using their tools differently. But this is hopefully a good overview of how this tool has helped our farm.
Yeah, thanks, Evan. Just a couple follow-up questions that I had. One, the slope. People can see it right here in this photo. You mentioned that it can slide across the field. I do get a fair number of questions from people who are looking to purchase it and ask how it does on slopes. It looks like you've flattened out your beds somewhat, so it's not like you're farming on the actual slope itself, but there still is a slope to the beds. What's the biggest challenge? Is it like the transplanter wants to pull downhill? Is it the rear end wants to slide downhill while you're pulling? What have you noticed?
Yeah, in general, it tends to be like kind of in this example here, I think there's 6 rows planted in this bed. And the lowest row, that's each of our beds is like a little terrace, and it's not perfectly flat. It still is sloped downhill a little bit, but it's terraced, and then it drops down to the pathway. And because we do have raised beds, which help us to mitigate erosion and lots of other things. So that lowest row particularly tends to be the most difficult. I'll tend to plant that first. And yeah, typically the tail end will start to slide down and slide off the bed into the pathway. So sometimes I'll actually be holding the handle that you normally pull by and then the handle that you carry it with, and I'll just be right down on the machine, guiding both ends of the machine just for that lowest row in the bed. And then once I get to the next row up, the bed tends to be, there's not an edge right there. And I tend to be able in general to just run it normally.
Got it.
So getting both hands on the machine, and I think there was a picture of that when I was right up against that cat tunnel wall.
Sure. Yep.
That's kind of how I manage that situation. And that's the issue, is just the tail end sliding out. And that may not be true in everybody's soil type as well. It's just in our soil type, that's what happens.
Actually leads into the next question I was going to ask you is, how would you describe your soil type on the slope there? In one of the pictures, I think near the beginning, I look like there's a stump in the middle of one of the beds. So what's the soil like that you're farming in? And what have you found works in your soil when you think about the closing wheels, the closing fins? How have you optimized those for your soil type?
That's a good question. Our soil type is where our fields are in our house is this dome about 14 feet deep of pretty nice. It's almost like river bottom sandy loam, almost, with probably less sand, more loam. And so it's really nice soil that in our region that erodes off of the ledges. There's ledges above us and all around our fields. The early settlers cleared all the rocks out of this particular field here. So we haven't had to remove a ton of big rocks. There still are rocks in it. And so there's really good deep soil, and it's very nice soil. It has maybe a little clay, but not much. So it's very well drained. In fact, maybe a little bit too well drained, given that we're on a south facing hillside. In terms of optimizing the Paperpot transplanter, I think it's less about soil type for us than moisture content. And I think one big improvement to the transplanter would be a way to very quickly adjust those closing fins. For us, like bending them to one position or another would only work on some days. If the soil is really wet, it's going to behave differently than on a day when it's drier, or a day when it's really dry. We just came out of a year and a half of drought up here, and so we were planting into dust some days. And so I think that could be an improvement, just a way to very quickly adjust those fins without having to bend them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so for that reason, I haven't really modified the fins very much. I've moved them a little bit, but just because it just depends on the day. So I figured I'd keep them right in the middle, pretty much how they came. And then I can modify other things that I do, like whether I lift up on the front, so there's more pressure down in the back, and on days when there's a lot of soil being pushed and it's burying the seedlings, that just brings the fins lower, so they're not burying the seedlings. Or the opposite, if they're not burying them enough, I can kind of, put a little more pressure on the front so the fins are higher and gathering a little bit more soil from farther away. So that's kind of how I approach it. So it's a lot of fine tune adjusting with my arm. And I think particularly in New England, we have, it's just big extremes from wet to dry. It's not like, say, farming in coastal British Columbia or California, where you might be pretty much dry and irrigating all summer. And so you can kind of set your planter, because your soil type is going to be similar the whole time. It's not going to be similar here. The texture is just going to change on a daily basis. And then we might have summers where it rains every day for a month and a half. That's pretty common here as well. So that's my long answer to your short question.
Yeah, no, I like it. One of the things you showed in one of the pictures was that interplanting. I thought that was interesting, doing that within the chain itself. After doing that for a few years, how do you like doing that?
I like it. It's not something that we always do. Typically, that's an early season strategy when we're doing those kind of lots of those early brassicas. I might do the same thing with kale, plant kale at 12 in a 6-inch tray, might plant kale at 12-inch spacing. For early kale, that's not going to go the whole season, that I'll harvest. And then when it gets too big, there'll be another bed coming along behind it. But then I'll interplant that with big bok choy every 6 inches. Or kale isn't something that people use the Paperpot transplanter tray for a lot. And this is a little off the interplanting subject, but I'll also plant kale in 6-inch cells, 3 rows, and then first we'll harvest that whole every other plant, so it's 12 inches apart, and then we'll harvest the whole middle row, and then we'll let the rest of it grow and then harvest it as you would harvest kale normally. So this allows us, and we just cut the whole plant when we're doing the plants that are in between, and this allows us to have a really high yielding bed of kale in the early season when we can really sell it well. In the middle of summer, it's very hard to sell kale around here. And so that's kind of one example. So we tend to do that more early season than we do mid season, just to like make sure that like we get our early broccoli in and we have plenty of radishes, which we might interplant with the early broccoli. So that's generally how we use it. I think there are a lot of potentials, and in different climates where different crops are growing, there's probably a ton more that can be done with it. But typically that's how we've used it. And then obviously we use it for interplanting the other way by just throwing in a row in between something else.
Right. Well, yeah. What about with green beans? I'm glad you showed that. That's one of the crops that you don't hear a lot of people doing in it. What have you found has been the key for timing on that, so the beans aren't too big or too root bound when you go to transplant them?
Yeah. So pretty much, when you do have a short window there, and then it is a real pain if you let them go too far, although they tend to survive fine, but sometimes you end up having to pull the cells apart as you go. But typically for us, I'm trying to think how long those seeds are in there, but if it's kind of warm in the germination area, it's probably about 10 days, 8 to 10 days, I would say. And then when they first come up and really unfurl their first two big leaves, that's the time, and not to let them get any bigger than that. Just when everything's unfurled, they'll have their cotyledons and then their first 2 true leaves. When those unfurl, that's the time to plant them. And then you have like a couple day window there. But if you wait longer than that, they may get root bound if it's really warm in the prop house.
Yeah, I love that.
But temperature can really help with that, Diego. If you know you're not going to make it, I put them someplace cool, maybe with a little shade. It will really slow that root growth down. And so that can help if I see, oh, that bed's not going to be open and they're growing too fast, I'll just slow them down.
What's your strategy for germinating crops up there? Seeing some of that snow piled up against the cat tunnel. I mean, you guys get a lot of snow. How are you germinating some of these crops? And then are you still off grid? So you probably don't.
Yes.
Okay. So you don't have a germination chamber or anything like that, do you?
No, but what we do is we built a super insulated farm building that has 12-inch thick cellulose walls, has a sunroom front, and that's where we grow our microgreens in that sunroom front. And then we also will start our early seedlings there. And so that building is heated by wood gasification boiler, and also has a lot of passive solar, particularly in March. Tends to be fairly sunny here. A lot of passive solar benefits as well. So we basically just it's pretty much a house, and for years, and we did all of this in our house. We have south facing windows in our straw bale house that we built, and we grew all of our seedlings and even our microgreens in our living room. Basically, we didn't have a living room really. It was our nursery. We'd have a living room for maybe 6 months of the year. And then we get to the point where, say in mid-March, where we will start heating our prop house with the wood gasification boiler. As soon as we start doing that, though, we're burning quite a bit of wood, and it's a pretty big job and fairly demanding on the solar power system. But that time of year, we tend to have a lot of sun, but sometimes we may have to run the generator to back that up.
Yeah, I love it. So it's really cool stuff, like, hearing this view of how you're doing things and sharing it. So, thanks so much for taking the time.
You're welcome. Nice talking with you, Diego.